Welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
In today's episode, we're talking all things disability, and who better to join us in the studio than the legendary Kate Nash OBE. Kate is a self-proclaimed agitator who invites people and organisations across the world to consider disability in a variety of ways and to see it as more of a positive life experience than we're often led to believe. With a passion for fairness and inclusion ignited by her own experiences with disability, Kate has been challenging and changing attitudes towards disabled employees for over 4 decades. She's the founder of Purple Space, the world's only networking and professional development hub for disabled employees and network leaders, and is the author of not just one, but 2 books, Positively Purple, which focuses on building an inclusive world, and Secrets and Big News, enabling people to be themselves at work. Kate, welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Craig, Dawn. Yeah, so looking forward to our time together.
It's going to be good, isn't it? You guys know each other from old as well, right? So you've known each other for a long time.
About 20 years, something like that. I mean, you use the word legend. It doesn't do justice to this lady by any means, but very, very proud and honoured to be sat here with you.
I should just leave you two to catch up for the next 10 minutes, right? It's been that one. Are you both well?
Yeah, really good, really good. Enjoying the summer and my writing, and I'm good.
Are you writing more? Are you going to write another book?
Yeah, I am. I stood down as chief executive last May and sold the business to Scope, fantastic NGO.
It seems like a nice fit.
Yeah, and so my objective was and is to do more writing, which is now my primary love. So I'm writing my next book, 52 Habits to Get In at Work, which is a collection of stories and thoughts and insights about how you get your first job as a disabled person, then how you climb up the greasy pole.
Nice.
Love that.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
And Dawn, you've just come back from about 75 flights around the world, right? So, so you're currently jet lagged.
I had 8 flights in 5 weeks, a little bit of mix of business and pleasure, but yeah, it has hit me, to be honest. But yeah, enjoying it. I'm very excited because it's Formula One weekend. So me and my Formula One buddy are off tomorrow morning at 4 a.m. for the weekend. So yeah.
That'd be exciting.
What about you?
Same. I'm a bit exhausted. I've just flown back from the Netherlands, so I'm in London today, having done a bit of travel in the Netherlands. So I'm a bit tired. Looking forward to going home to my own bed tonight and seeing my boy. So but other than that, I'm all good. All things are good, positive. So shall we get into the episode? Kate, I'm not sure whether you're aware, hopefully you are, but we normally start the show with a news story linked to the topic that we're going to talk about. But eagle-eyed listeners and viewers will remember that a few episodes ago, we discussed the BBC News article about a Paralympian by the name of Piers Gilliver. And at the time, Dawn and I said we were going to get an expert to give their opinion on this news story because we came to a bit of a stalemate with where we were with it. So let's just remind listeners and viewers of the story, or what the story was about. So BBC News had reported the story that gold medalist Paralympian Piers Gilbert from Wiltshire was refused the hotel room that he had paid for when staff saw that he was using a wheelchair. Piers was told by staff at the Ibis in Rotherham that it was company policy, and despite him saying that he didn't need an accessible room or any help, we're assuming that Piers had booked the room online and didn't want or need to book an accessible room. However, on arrival, when staff saw that he and his partner, who is also a wheelchair user, they were told that because they were wheelchair users, they could not stay on the upper floors. It may cause issues with insurance or in case of a fire. Mr. Gilliver from Trowbridge then said he could see there was a lift and an evacuation chair, and the couple's wheelchairs were narrow enough to fit through the standard doors. Despite explaining he travels a lot and often stays in multi-storey hotels, sometimes with hundreds of other athletes with disabilities, Mr. Gilliver says the couple was still asked to leave. Subsequently, Ibis apologised and said the chain would take immediate corrective action and staff were being retrained. But when we discussed it, we then got a bit stuck on risk assessments and, where does that liability sit for employers? So we thought what we would do first is just play you back the clip, or play everybody back the clip, so that they can remember where Dora and I got stuck. And then, no pressure, but we're going to ask for your help to try and solve this.
But if there is provision for all of those things, it's a difficult one.
That's kind of where I came down to it as well. I was actually quite torn on it, because my first reaction when I read the headline was, oh, God's sake, not another one, right? How, this is...
Left on trains.
Exactly. We hear it all the time. And Tanni Gray-Thompson, who's a member of the House of Lords in the UK, is a big advocate for this stuff. And she highlights the plight of individuals, particularly wheelchair users, where they get treated inappropriately for obvious reasons. And my immediate reaction was that it was another example of that. Then when I read a bit about the story, I then thought, actually, the hotel chain have just capitulated too quickly here. What are they retraining people on? Because actually, if there was a fire, the lift wouldn't work.
No.
Because most hotels now, the lifts just turn off in a fire, in which case that individual would have been stranded on the top floor, or members of staff would have had to go up and evacuate them and take them down from the top floor to exit the hotel. Now, I don't know what day of the week this was or how many staff they have, but to your point, that's a risk assessment issue. And if there are accessible rooms on the ground floor, which makes it easier to evacuate somebody, then I think there's an element of safety and risk assessment work that needs to be done here. So I'm a bit torn, and I don't know what the answer is. So we'll stop there. And Kate, we're going to just hand over to you at this point to try and help us out.
Well, look, you said you looked for an expert, but you brought me in, so I joke. Well, it is an interesting one, isn't it? And I think there's a lot more behind the scenes that we possibly don't know that has impacted on what could seemingly be a blatant piece of legislation. Sure. So just winding it back, on the one hand, we have in the Equality Act 2010, although the DDA 95, 30 years of standard legislation that requires hotels to make provision for their disabled customers. So it is wholly illegal to treat disabled customers unfairly, or to discriminate, or to provide reasonable adjustments or adjust policy, etc. And the only exceptions to that, in rare cases, is if you have got a proportionate and legitimate aim for ensuring the safety of other guests or staff. So, for example, if you're a small hotel, for example, and you've got evidence, so you've gone through all the fire and safety risks, and those reports are suggesting that you're going to put other people at risk by making an adjustment, then you can legitimately discriminate. However, and it's a big however, we're talking about a huge hotel chain here, the Ibis in Rotherham, in this case. And therefore, it would be really hard for a hotel chain of that size to discriminate against a disabled wheelchair user. So the question in my mind is, what provision are they making to help their customers demonstrate what they need? So I think you covered that a little bit. How are they asking the right questions? How are they making it easier for disabled guests to get what they need? And it sounds to me that they have got absolutely nothing in place. Now, just before this show, I went onto the website because I'm a nosy Parker, Craig. Dawn, I couldn't help myself.
Love it.
Because, if, as you say, the hotel chain has capitulated, then you would think now that on their website there would be provision to share with the hotel what you need, and there isn't. Wow. So right now I could legitimately have made a full booking with needs that might counter their legitimate claim. We don't know that. There's no way of accessing those reports. Sure. So it all rests on that. And I can't believe that those staff had not been trained to understand what could have been done differently and better in this case.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's really interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. So there you go. Investigate the situation.
Absolutely.
I love that. But
and it's a simple fix, actually, isn't it? It's a text box.
Yeah.
Correct.
That goes anything we need to know, anything you need to tell us, or however you want to legitimately word it.
Yeah.
And completing that for somebody to actually read. But this is the challenge more broadly, isn't it? You write notes in those boxes to say, can I have a room that's away from the lift, or can I have a fan in the room, or whatever it is, and nobody's ever read it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you think disclosure plays an issue here? Because we know that people are nervous to disclose things in employment situations. This is slightly different. This person was a consumer at the time, but in do you think disclosure might play a part here?
I think you're right, Craig. And you touch on an interesting point, because on the one hand, the customer provision is an anticipatory piece of legislation, unlike employment. So you have to ask your employer if you need a workplace adjustment. So that it's different when it comes to customer provision. Providers have to anticipate that a good proportion of their customers will have a disability.
That's interesting.
But disclosure, we're now talking, this is 30 years after the legislation.
Yeah.
So we have youngsters like Piers, who I think is just 30. So he has grown up quite rightly in a world where he can legitimately expect good provision. That's a good thing. To be able to have the confidence where you can assume that hotel provision are going to deliver what you need. So you wouldn't necessarily think you have to keep on, as you say, disclose or share aspects of perhaps your identity that not that is hidden, because for Piers it absolutely isn't. But why should you have to keep doing that?
Quite, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess subsequently, so we all travel quite a lot, right? And I'm sure we have all stayed in accessible rooms on higher floors too. So actually, when I was reading the story the first time around, I was thinking, oh, well, they'd have to send someone up to get them, use the evacuation chair. That's quite an onerous thing for a hotel to do. But actually, you already have accessible rooms on higher floors in hotels. I know that because I've stayed in some of them. So if that's the case for other hotels, then that argument that I put forward last time doesn't stand, right? Because therefore, he could use a higher floor in an accessible room, regardless of whether
tiny intricacy of the legislation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you putting staff at risk?
Yeah.
That's the line that is the bit that makes this grey.
Yeah. And the only way you can legally discriminate is if the issue is serious, if it is evidence-based, and if it's unmitigable. So you cannot get around it by other means. And I think the question in this news report, which you cleverly highlight, is the fact it feels like something has really gone wrong in that process, because it could be. I'd find it hard to believe, but let's give the IBIS the benefit of the doubt here. It could be that top floor has had an assessment that suggests wheelchair users cannot use it safely.
Yeah.
And it may be that there's not enough staff around at night, for example.
Sure.
So that could be a legitimate means. But those cases by which you can lawfully discriminate are so rare and so few and far between. It feels to me that there's been a missing link.
Yeah.
And staff, I talk about Piers as a disabled customer, has grown up quite rightly expectantly of good provision. But we're talking about staff potentially too, who have been less aware of the introduction of legislation and what you can and can't do. And maybe they're taken as something very crude and written and something half seen.
Yeah.
And they've added 2 and 2 and made a number that really does not stack up.
Of course, yeah. And I guess, there's quite a lot about the story that we don't know. How old the hotel is, as an example. We don't know, what other offers the staff made. The report makes it sound as if it was, you just can't stay here, leave.
Yeah.
They may have offered a room on the ground floor that he refused. We don't know any of this, right? So it's contextual. But for organisations thinking about this, I think the point you made is right, is that this, for customers, we have to make an assumption that some of our customers will have these needs, and therefore we need to make those adjustments for them. And we're going to talk a little bit more, hopefully, about adjustments as we get into the episode today, because I think that's quite a big issue for organisations and employers to think about. But actually, whereas, employers tend to expect the employee to disclose or declare, whereas this legislation talks about actually, as a consumer, you need to assume
Absolutely.
Love that.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's where it can be confusing for both employers that are providing services.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Really
It is, and
complicated.
there's those tiny little bits in that legislation that you could argue quite strongly either way, isn't there?
And that's why we got kind of stuck, I think, the last time when we were talking about it, because we were in that kind of zone of, oh, actually, this feels sensible, but this feels sensible. And that's, well, look, I think you've helped us with that question today. So that's really helpful.
That's
Employers should be doing, I think, regular assessments of their services, their facilities, to understand, have they done the assumption bit? Have they made those provisions for consumers? And are they encouraging people to disclose? So let's talk about disability a bit more widely if we can, because I think that was really helpful to answer that question. Has it progressed, do you think, in recent years, particularly in the workplace?
I would say yes, but you're talking to an old bird here, Craig. I go way back.
Never.
I'm going to take Dawn with me on this. However, the short answer, I think, is yes, we have progressed. And, if I look back 30 plus years pre-legislation, it was routine. We heard case after case after case, or we had swathes of evidence that suggests that individuals, particularly in employment, were not being able to be offered nor then access some very simple workplace adjustments or not so simple adjustments that would enable them to secure a job and then flourish at work. And now, while of course discrimination does still exist, it would be foolish to suggest otherwise, we also see there's a degree of one, expectation, and two, routinisation of the adjustments that exist. So in my plus years, I do see legislation has really bedded down and baked in. It is not uncommon now for employees, I think particularly with larger employers, to be able to easily access in their own steam and in their own way information on their intranet site that is visible, easily understandable about where you can get a workplace adjustment. So I think things have changed.
Yeah.
The but is expectations have also changed. We live in a supercharged digital world where now it's really easy to compare and contrast individual stories and expectations. So, and I think that's a good thing. I'm not suggesting it is not a good thing for young disabled people to grow up not expecting of their employer.
Sure.
But what it means is the stakes are higher now if you really get it wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When you were talking then about the, particularly with larger employers, and that, we tend to work with a lot bigger employers as well. But actually, there is routes for smaller employers to provide adjustments too, right? So I remember from a previous role when I worked at Remploy many years ago, we ran the Access to Work scheme for the government, which is essentially providing funding for organisations, regardless of their size, to be able to produce those adjustments for individuals, or the technology or whatever the kit might be that was needed. So you're right. I think there's been a shift in that side of things.
I think to be entirely balanced, and I'm going to be slightly controversial here.
We love it when she gets controversial.
She's usually right as well.
You're probably going to guess what I'm about to say, is that some of these provisions have let the users down. And therefore the reputational element of them is not considered as impactful as they could. And I think there's some really, really good research and work happening at the moment, and certainly happened a couple of years ago, about the provision, the Big Work survey, for example, and how that really looks at the reality of this. For fear of being a little sycophantic, the Business Disability Forum have always done some really good quality work and quality research. And, if we look at the fact that almost 80% of people are having to find their own adjustments, some of these services are not delivering as they should. So forgive me, but it's a call out to say we need to do better.
Yeah, and I ran a piece of work for a large energy organisation a few years ago to help And I would say they'd done some really good work, right? So they had employees who had adjusted vehicles, all kinds of things, right? As you know, everything from e-readers, all of that kind of stuff to adjusted vehicles. So some really good adjustments, and actually could have been really proud of that. And they said to me, but it's not landing. Well, we still can't get our managers to understand what's available, how to navigate this stuff, right? So one of the examples they gave me was an employee had applied for a job with this particular team, and the job was they would have to go and cut down trees when the trees hit the pylons and stuff like that. And this person was in a wheelchair, and they said, our managers took them on because they felt like they couldn't say no to the individual because they had a disability. And I was like, okay, that's an interesting dilemma. Firstly, why did the individual think that they could apply for that job, right? So there was lots more to it. And then you had other managers who were basically refusing to recruit people because they just didn't know how they could do the work or get involved in the work. And actually, when I then went in and did some discovery and started talking to the line managers, the majority of it came from fear. And they just didn't know. There was no malice in it, right? They didn't do these things because they wanted to make people's lives difficult. They were just fearful of getting it wrong, or fearful of not being able to complete their work because the individual wouldn't be able to do it, you know, this kind of stuff. And when we then did a piece of work and focused quite heavily on what do we mean by a reasonable adjustment, right? Because for a wheelchair user, climbing a ladder, it's not a reasonable adjustment to get them something where they can go. That's not reasonable for an organization. But actually, for an organization to provide a car for somebody to move, your company car scheme, that is a reasonable adjustment for a big organization. The minute we started helping managers understand the difference between reasonable and unreasonable, a lot of that fear just dissipated. And their record now is fantastic with working with disabled talent. And they've got some brilliant people in their organization doing some brilliant work as a result of that. But I thought it was quite brave of the organization to tackle that with managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you touch on the most important point, Craig, which is this is never once and done, is it? We can't expect any workforce to which is ever changing, to always understand what the legislation means, how you can make some simple adjustments, and how you enter sometimes difficult conversations about the more complex and or costly adjustments that exist.
Oh.
It's a forever piece of work, because we know disability is an aspect of human identity that some individuals find it hard to identify with, which means, and particularly those with hidden impairments, means they have a choice as to whether to share or not to share. And I think that makes it really hard for employers to get their arms around this and to bake in and have constant upskilling of their own people. It's never once and done. It's a forever story.
Sure.
And I think what's, just to add to that, because I couldn't agree with you both more, I think the reality is that this whole topic takes us away sometimes from the things we know in business, the measurable outputs, the impact, the tangible statistics. We are almost afraid to focus on those elements. And that's always been my thought around this. You know, I'm a bore about the impact of things anyway, but, I've been reading some really interesting stuff in the Times about the disability impact. And there's some fantastic evidence to support, but you're back to that point you make about fear. Yeah. And people don't necessarily have disability experts in their business. And some will choose to blunder along and not seek the advice that they should. Yeah. Back in the day, you were that person. Susan Scott Parker was that person. How do we navigate this difficult issue? And people don't do that. So it goes in the too difficult pile, is my opinion sometimes. And therefore, we don't always look at the impact.
It's very true.
It's interesting you were saying then, though, about that kind of impact stuff, right? So when we were at Remploy, we had a lot of employer partners that we work with. And actually, when we talk to them about hiring disabled talent and the impact that can have on their workplaces, they were always, really surprised when we gave them some statistics around actually attrition is lower with disabled talent, right? Sickness is lower with disabled talent, right? Because most disabled individuals know what their disability is and therefore how to manage it. So therefore, they don't need additional time off. They don't need, and the employers we work with were always quite surprised, going, that can't be true. That can't be true. And I'm like, yes, it's 100% true, right?
Yeah.
Because majority of disabled individuals, they know exactly what their disability is and how to manage it. They don't actually need your help. Once you've given them an adjustment, they'll probably be longer serving, harder working, and everything else that you have. And people were really surprised by that impact statistics we used to give them.
And also, thinking about your description of impact, I think sometimes we encourage employers, dare I say it, to count the wrong things. So there's often such a focus on data collection.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute it's not proper and prudent for employers from time to time to want to understand the accuracy of their data. The reality is, any employer of any size, of any jurisdiction, of any geography will have around 12 to 20% of their people. So maybe instead we should encourage employers to count perhaps the speed by which they can deliver an elegant, easy to use workplace adjustment. I remember one very famous UK-based retail bank that had gotten down their response to something like 28 days, which I think is pretty good for a workplace adjustment.
Yeah.
But now it's not common parlance. And, thinking about Purple Space's Global Summit last year, one of the calls that comes from disabled employees across the world is the necessity for a visible, easy-to-use workplace adjustment. So for me, it's a no-brainer to encourage employers to measure the speed by which that's delivered, rather than worry about have the right people been counted when we know so often we mask our experiences.
And that's why you're here, Kate, because that is absolutely what you're referring to is what I refer to as the IO equation. You do an input, you get an output, and most people stop there because they've collected a bit of data and they've gone, so we've made some progress. What they don't look at is the outcome and the impact, and look at it much broader. And that's precisely what you're applying to this topic. And I know so many organisations who go, we're brilliant. These are the 10 bits of data we collect, and it's taken us 3,000 hours to do it. And I'm like, why? What? What actual impact does that make? And I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on adjustment passports?
I love them.
Yeah,
with
me
all
too.
my heart.
Me too.
Yeah, I remember BT many, many moons ago was the first organisation that created the passport, and then Business Disability Forum made it better and more universal. So I think they're a fantastic mechanism to support people to demonstrate and think about what they need and want, and then to go through that organisation through promotions or change of team or change of manager with not having to overly and constantly share. So, I'm a huge fan of them.
So for the benefit of our listeners that aren't aware, an adjustment passport is essentially a working document that you have when you apply for an adjustment with your organisation. So you only have to really do it once, right? And then wherever you go throughout the organisation, if your line manager changes or you get promoted, you don't have to keep constantly disclosing your disability all the time, or having to go through the same process again. So if an adjustment is in place from I have a bit of kit, or I have particular hours where I need to do things differently, it's documented in your passport, it stays with you, and your line managers can just look at it and review it. You don't have to go through the endless point of disclosing your disability over and over again. I'm a huge fan of them. I think they're one of the best things that was invented for disabled talent.
Yeah. They're great.
And for employers, because employers don't want to have to keep going through the whole process every time either, right? Yeah. It's too onerous.
Yeah. Do you know, it's funny what makes me giggle? The average cost of, say, a maternity or paternity placement is around £14,000-15,000, whereas the average cost of a workplace adjustment for people with disabilities is about £1,000. There's different studies. The reality is babies don't wait, I think, more or less. And yet it can be the case that people will wait for weeks and months for an adjustment that is likely to be a lot less of a cost. Now, don't get me wrong, some adjustments do cost more, but this is not rocket science.
No.
But
I'll bet people don't know that, though. I'll bet if you asked 100 people what costs more, maternity arrangements or adjustments, they would say adjustments.
That's a great quote.
It's a really good,
because of that fear that you were sharing earlier,
Yeah. I'm conscious we talked a little bit already about the kind of legislation and things. So I would like us to just touch on, because you've mentioned this already. So firstly, the definition of disability, I think, is important. So in the Equality Act 2010, which replaced the DDA Act, if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities is the definition, right? But one of the things that you talked about earlier is hidden disabilities or hidden differences. And we often associate disabilities with physical disabilities because we can see them, right? But we don't actually understand that disability is much wider than that in organisations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting. I know you're both fans of storytelling as a mechanism, both externally in the society at large as well as internally, to help us understand that we come in many shapes and sizes and guises. And disability is an experience that can be seen as well as an experience that cannot be seen. But I think it's still hard for individuals to understand the myriad of ways by which those symptoms, behaviours can be exhibited, and therefore what can be done differently and better to make provision and to accommodate. It's complicated stuff.
It is. I've got a bit of a funny story, and I know I've told you this already. It happened this week. As you know, I've got various neurodiversities, and I was asked to speak at a neurodiversity conference this week online, and the organiser of the event very kindly took my slides and branded them beautifully in all sorts of pretty colours and put my slides of white type on a yellow background. Now, I can't see that. So they very kindly produced these beautiful, about to go live, and I'm like, I have no idea what these slides are. So just had to talk and it was fine. But that was a classic of one of those, if there's 10 tips, just understand contrast.
But that for me leans into what I think is probably one of the biggest challenges for disabled talent, and not just disabled talent, just disabled people more generally, is people make assumptions. And they shouldn't, because actually, one person with a disability is one person with a disability. And we say the same. So my son is autistic, right? And I say to people regularly, and I get the usual, what's his gift, right? What's his magic gift? And I say, he's a human. Like, that's his magic gift. He has a heart and he's a wonderful child, right? But they genuinely think autism's superpower because of the movie from years ago, right? And I use that description of, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because the spectrum is so wide. But the same applies for disabilities, right? And we just assume that because one person might need one adjustment, everybody needs the same one. And as having worked with lots of disabled talent over the years, I know the level of frustration that brings them when they say, it is so frustrating when people just assume what help I might need, rather than saying, do you need some help? And then waiting for them to reply, they then start moving their chair or start doing, and they get so frustrated. Certain friends of mine just get really annoyed by it.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I've seen that play out both ways. I've seen, I don't know whether you have, I've seen people who are like, don't ask me. I don't want you to ask me. I'll tell you if I need anything. And then I've also seen the opposite. Well, you never asked me. Which am I meant to do? Which is what's best advice? And I think, again, we just have to be curious, don't we? And we have to feel our way.
Yeah, it's recognising, isn't it, that there's two things that play out. On the one hand, humans are notoriously curious.
Yeah.
We are an inquisitive breed, and that's an okay thing. But we are also, I think, innately scared of difference and fearful. None of us want to make, an error in front of people. We don't want to look ridiculous and stupid. We don't want to feel that we've either humiliated ourselves or embarrassed another human. And I think that means sometimes we make shortcuts and that leads to assumptions, which is not a good thing.
Yeah.
In my current book that I'm writing, 52 Habits, I tell the story of, for example, I have arthritis and I've had it for a very long time. So I get in and out of taxis very inelegantly, okay? And sometimes if I'm working in London...
It's like me on a Saturday night.
Legs akimbo, the lot. And I've kind of got my own workarounds and techniques for dealing with often other people's embarrassment. But I tell the story of sometimes when I'm working in London, I may be in, I don't know, upwards of 10, 12 black cabs in a day. And I can bet 99.9% of those cab drivers will say, "So what happened to you, love?" Not always the love at the end, but you get my drift. Now, if you add up the times I'm in London, the fact we have 4,000 weeks, I think, in a lifetime, the fact that we've got 45 years, that's a lot of asks.
Yeah.
Therefore, and I think many of us choose our own workarounds to screen out what some people will call ableism.
Yeah.
I talk about it as other people's stuff. And we do things in our own way to sometimes shorten those conversations or move on.
Yeah.
I have fun. Sometimes I have MS. Sometimes I have had a landmine injury. And I do it just because I'm bored of other people sharing with me the need for copper bracelets. So, but I think you're touching, Craig, on that human instinct mostly to be kind.
Yeah.
But we shortcut into assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not so good.
And I think that's very true. I was on a flight recently and there was a mature lady to my right-hand side who was clearly struggling to put her socks back on.
Yeah.
And my natural instinct, I went, "Can I help?" She went, "No, thank you," and was quite obtuse about it. Now, I meant no malice by that at all. I was just very conscious I'm sat here perfectly able to do that. And she wasn't.
Yeah.
Difficult.
It's really hard, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think sometimes we're tired, aren't we, as individuals to have. So from time to time we will, work with or be exposed to people who are just fed up. And that's okay. Yeah. What must never happen is that we never offer.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be wrong.
Yeah.
That's true. And that language bit is really quite important, but also entertaining. So you picked on something there that sparked a memory for me when I was at Remploy, and we had a colleague who was blind and took great pleasure in hiding his dog under the desk. So people would walk into the office and say, "Oh, morning, lovely day," and he'd say, "Is it?" And you just literally, and people would then be horrified that they may have offended him. And he thought it was highly hilarious, right? Because he used to just like to wind people up in lots of different ways. And actually a lot of, like you said, a lot of disabled people that I've worked with and have friends with over years, they do have fun with that because they get to that point where they just think, come on.
Yeah.
And the other thing that they don't like, or I think I'm stereotyping here, but I've also heard people say they don't like, is when people talk about them being courageous or brave all of the time.
Inspiring.
Yes. Oh, aren't you inspiring? Why? Because I've come to work. It's that kind of thing. And again, people don't mean malice by it, do they? But for an individual who has to hear that, to your point, 12 times a day, 52 weeks a year over their lifetime, it can probably be utterly exhausting.
Yeah. And I think at times, I'm 62, I'm talking about having arthritis since I was 15. So if you do the maths, that's a very long time. And I'm not alone in being exposed to and have to accommodate sometimes clumsiness or intrusivity and so on. So you have to, that's why, I do what I do. You have to find your own methods of being confident, from sometimes closing down conversations, because that's okay. But at the same time, recognise the majority of intent comes from a place of kindness. And I choose very deliberately and consciously to exercise that belief, because to do otherwise is to go to a place I don't want to go. And, we live in a complex, very challenged world if we look out in terms of the wars that now exist. But mostly, the world is full of individuals who want to be kind. But it's hard when you keep being asked by a taxi driver, so what happened to you? So you've developed your tools and your techniques, and I think that's what gets us through this world.
Yeah, love that.
And I think the more you get to know people, the more you can understand that, right? And you can therefore help and be good supportive allies and things. And I think it's an interesting one. I'm very conscious of time, so I want to touch on a couple of things before we finish up. So the first thing I'd like to touch on is, for those who may be listening in the UK, this week has been a very, shall we say, politically stormy week for disabled people in the UK because of the benefits landscape. Now, having worked for Employer, I have some knowledge and interest in this area. But part of the UK government strategy was they were going to, or trying to, reduce the benefits bill that particularly supported disabled talent through the personal independent payments and things. It's now been paused, and we'll see what comes of the review in due course. But the reason I wanted to just talk about it is because in that descriptor, the government has talked about how that benefits bill has ballooned over the last 10, 20 years, whatever, and that it's going to continue to rise to I think it's about 100 billion by the end of this decade, right? And I'd love to get your take on that situation because, and I'll just share a personal story with you. Like you, my mum had, she was born with Still's disease, which turned into rheumatoid arthritis over the years. And I remember as a child having to put my mum's socks on for her in the morning and help her get dressed and that kind of stuff, right? For which she hated it, right? She didn't want her, 12-year-old son doing that for her, but she did it, right? Because she had no help from anybody. So she didn't have access to carers or from whatever, but she hated the fact that we had to do it as her children. But we did it. We didn't care. We knew no different. So it wasn't problematic. She applied one time for a grant to get easy turn taps in our kitchen, because she found it really difficult to turn the taps on when she was cooking for us or whatever. And she got turned down for this grant at the time to get easy turn taps. She had no help, no benefits help. And yet, a few doors away, we had a family who was overweight and who had, and this, whether this is correct or not, was the perception at the time, had a whole extension built on their house at the same time, right? And so mum's disability wasn't categorized or classed as enough for her to qualify for anything at the time. And I guess that for me feels like why the bill is bigger these days is because of individuals like my mum, and where we've got more educated as a society on the types of things people need help with, it's become more accessible, and therefore the bill inevitably does rise. But that's just a personal thing for me. I'm really interested to hear what you both think about what's been in the press this week, because I've been quite torn when I've been listening to it.
Same. Yeah, same. I think on the one hand, we have a genuine problem that I suppose, for want of a better word, the budget has ballooned, and those reasons are very complex and they're varied, and they include the fact that many young people, of course, through COVID have experienced mental health challenges and have challenges now in securing jobs, etc. So, it includes the fact, as we said before, the rise of storytelling now makes it easier for people to recognise themselves in the stories. I think particularly people who experience mental ill health and neurodivergence, they recognise themselves. And because life is tough, and we have had now decades of austerity and cost cutting and etc., then it's a human thing to want to secure the benefits that you might be entitled to.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think it's a universal knowledge that something has to give. But on the other hand, we know that disabled people still struggle to secure even some of the basic adjustments that they need in order to get that first job and flourish.
Yeah.
So I think for me, the greater question in terms of what has happened this week is how it got to this point
Agreed, yeah.
before capitulation. And, whether, we hear how co-production is the way forward and consultation. And that is partly the reality. I think that this government needs to do a much better job of running at the legitimate problem, but by talking to and getting into some of those discussions.
So I was really surprised this week just about the amount of MPs who didn't realise that PIP wasn't a work benefit, right? And it just fascinates me. And yet they're voting on this bill and they don't even understand it. I'm fascinated by that.
It is. It goes back to our earlier point, Craig, around the legislation now being 30 years old. I think we lose over time historical knowledge about intent. So we lose knowledge about where there are legitimate ways in which you can discriminate, for example. I was campaigning 20 plus years pre-1995. And in terms of these benefits, as you say, these are not. I'm aghast. Yeah, the relative ignorance of some of the MPs about the purpose and intent behind the independence is ludicrous.
We have to also consider the demographic impact on that. We're all meant to be living to 100 years of age. The preventative medicines that are hugely costly haven't always been as readily available. And, you make the point about the younger generation, but the older generation too, didn't have the luxury of some of that prevention that is now afforded to the population. So I think it's inevitable that amount is going to grow.
And you also talked about the fact that expectations are different now. So if our expectations of employers are different, then so too are our expectations of benefit and help and support, right?
And the care system.
Yeah, okay. So I thought that was really interesting as well, because it's been a really hot topic this week, right, for sure. Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so let's do the so what. If you could summarize quickly, what could or should employers do who are unsure of this topic, maybe considering hiring disabled talent but a bit unsure of it, or, if they could do 3 or 4 things to just improve the experience for disabled colleagues or tap into the disabled talent pool that massively exists. And the reason I'm asking this question is because if you look at the statistics, the rate of unemployment for disabled talent has been stubbornly double that for non-disabled talent for many, many years now. And so I think we have to create an environment where employers do a bit more in this space. And I hope personally that by the time my son gets to working age, when he enters the workplace, he does so in an environment where employers are really comfortable in this space. So if you could summarize for us, both of you, please. Let's start with you, Kate. What are your thoughts?
I would say, 1, tap into the expert organisations like your good selves, like Business Disability Forum, like Purple Space, so like Disability Confidence Scheme. So, if you really are found wanting when it comes to being able to really understand what you need to do and when, then tap into the great advice that does exist out there. Yeah. I think secondly, if you're of a certain size, support your disability employee resource group or set one up. There is nothing like learning directly from your own people in order to understand how to improve your employment and or customer policy. And then lastly, I would tap into storytelling campaigns, whether that's external or internal, to normalise or usualise the experience of disability, which is so common. This doesn't have to be in the difficult box unless we choose to hide. So there's plenty out there, but certainly tap into.
Love that.
You're going to pay me for that advert later, I suppose. But yeah, the advice is out there. You've just got to seek it out.
Yeah,
I think that's true. And I think, if I can add a layer of some more basic advice, to be honest, in terms of, introduce some basic charter or checklist.
Yeah.
Here's 10 things we as a company commit to do. It's been done many times before for many years, but it is hugely effective. These simple things like even design standards will really help organisations. The other point is that if we look at the average age of the average CEO right now, they're my age. And the reality of that is that we've got to appeal to what would appeal to those key decision makers. And the influencers have got to talk in that way to be able to overcome whatever prejudices we may have experienced. So it's a really important point about what does it for them. Is it impact? Is it talent? What is their issue? And like you say, there's some great support available. At the end of the day, we shouldn't forget this huge pool of talent we've got sitting here. And we've got great organisations like Even Break, for example, working really hard to support disabled talent legitimately into meritocracy jobs.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly important too. This shouldn't be the final characteristic because it's a bit too difficult.
Sure. I love that. And being ex-employee, I'm a big advocate of tapping into those schemes that are available. And they're funded through the government as well to help disabled talent into workplaces and to help them overcome the barriers that exist for them getting into work. But we need employers to come to the table to do some of that, right? And open up the opportunities for individuals. And I never tire of saying you'll be pleasantly surprised by the productivity levels you get from that talent pool because, superb often that goes unrecognised. And then if I had just one more tip, it would be measure adjustment timeframes, love that, and do passports because you don't want people having to endlessly have to keep disclosing their disability with you as well. Okay.
And educate.
Yes, for sure.
And educate.
Help your managers in particular understand what is a reasonable adjustment versus what is not a reasonable adjustment as well. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll have to do some listeners' questions next time. But as always, we do like to end our episode with our regular feature, Woke or Joke. This is where one of us asks the other one a question and we have to guess, is it a woke, true question, or a joke, false question? But Kate, I believe you have come with a woke or joke for us this time round.
I have. So is it woke or joke that a police officer with no disability was awarded over 26k for direct disability discrimination?
Oh my gosh.
Oh.
That's so hard. I want to say absolutely that's a joke. But something is telling me it's true. Something is telling me that is woke. But I always get these things wrong. So I'm going to say woke. I'm going to say it's true.
I'm going to agree, actually.
The answer is woke.
Wow.
Yeah.
Or should I say true?
Tell us why.
Yeah, what was it?
So, it's more nuanced, obviously, than the headline first appears, as with all things. So the officer's hearing loss had never caused her any problems in doing her job, and it was agreed that it was not a disability within the meaning of the Equality Act. Okay. However, her application to be transferred to a differing force was rejected based on the decision maker's perception that her hearing problem meant that she was or might become incapable of performing frontline duties.
Wow.
So after she brought proceedings, an employment tribunal found that she had suffered direct discrimination, contrary to Section 13 of the Act, and awarded her £26,000 in damages. So the decision maker treated her less favourably based on an actual or potential disability, which amounted to a protected characteristic. So that decision was subsequently upheld by the employment appeal.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It's always nuanced, right? Because part of me said that must be a joke. And then I was like, no.
The gut was saying
100%, yeah. And it's always nuanced. Which is where we began today's episode, wasn't it? By talking about the fact that assumptions, we don't know. There's lots more nuance to these examples than perhaps we will ever understand. And it's more important that we ask, find out, get involved.
So just to be clear, Kate, that means everybody buys me dinner.
I'll make a note. Where do you want to go?
Okay, that's it for another episode. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been an absolute pleasure to have you with us in the studio. And thank you, the listeners, for listening, as always. But until next time, bye from me.
Bye from me.
Goodbye.
Thank you for watching and listening. If you liked our discussions and our content, why not leave us a review? And so we can reach even more listeners. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe or the like buttons and the follow buttons on anywhere you get your podcasts from. You can also find us on all the social media platforms at You Must Be Woking, or just search hashtag YMB Woking, where you can continue the conversation and get involved in the chat after the show.